Oh, okay. Okay. Can you keep something down here? Up. No. You can still. Fine. On notebook you can do it. On notebook. Too cold, is it? I mean, okay. Yeah, it's time. I was about to call you guys. Come in. Noisy. I don't know who's playing that music. Hey, Karthik. Karthik, come. Closing this door. I told you. No, I given. No, we have printed out the time and given him. Okay, welcome back to the first technical session. So we have the first speaker for this plenary session, Dr. John Ablett. John is a senior curator in non-marine mollusca and cephalophyta in the Natural History Museum, Life Sciences, United Kingdom. Over the last few years, he's been responsible for the curation of the terrestrial and freshwater mollusca, plus the cephalopod collections within the mollusk group in the Department of Life Sciences at the Natural History Museum. He has, over the years, been involved in the general care, curation and preservation and reorganization, as well as loaning of the dry and spirit collections under his care. He has also been involved in the identification, databasing, preservation and accession of new material. And he will deliver the first talk on Godwin Austen, the man, the mountains, his mollusks and the museums. Over to John. Sure.
Hi, everyone. First of all, I just want to say what an amazing pleasure and very proud to have been invited my first time in India, despite working on Mollusc from this region. So thank you, Aravind, and the whole organizing committee. It really is a very great honor. So as Aravind said, 100 years since Godwin Austen died, and this symposium is the perfect way, I think, to celebrate his legacy. So today, I'm going to give you a whistle-stop tour, and what I'm going to talk about is, well, why? Why is Godwin Austen important? Why are we sort of hanging this whole symposium over this one man and his relationship with Indian malacology? I'm going to tell you a little bit about the man himself. How did he come to be interested in molluscs, and why was he in India? I'm going to talk about the mountains. He was, as I'm going to tell you, he was interested in the mountainous regions in the north mainly. And most importantly, I'm going to talk about his molluscs, how many, where they were from, how he was collecting them, who was collecting them for him. And then finally, the museums, where his specimens and his collections are found now. And I'm going to talk only a very little bit about what I think his legacy is and my thoughts for the future. But actually, I think Godwin Austen's legacy is in this room. It's all the researchers, the students, all working on Indian malacology. So I'm not going to deal too much with that. So before I start, I just wanted to introduce the institution where I work. So I work in the Natural History Museum in London, this beautiful building. We've been there since 1881. Well, I haven't. I've been there for 20 years, but the collections have been there since 1881, and before that, they were part of the British Museum in Bloomsbury. But there was just so much natural history objects that they wonderfully built us this lovely cathedral to nature, as it's often called. The mollusk collection. So I look after about 8 million specimens, bivalves, gastropods, and all those other strange and wonderful groups that we all love. And as well as those 8 million specimens, we have around 66,000 type specimens and probably another 6,000 or so unrecognized types. I spend an awful lot of my time looking through the general collections, looking for unlocalized types. And I've done that for many of you in this room, I think. At the moment, we have 3 curators. There's myself, who works on terrestrial land snails and cephalopods. Don't ask why, it's a historical legacy. Then we have Dr. Tom White in the top left, who looks after the bivalve, cephalopods and chitons. Andrea Salvador on the top right, who does the marine molluscs. We only currently have one molluscan researcher, Suzanne Williams, who currently specializes in color and vision, and not employed, but comes in most days. Our old scientific associate, John Taylor, works on bivalves, who is a legend. And we also have PhDs, students and scientific associates. Just to give you a little few pictures, most of those 8 million, probably about 7.5 million 7.5 million specimens are dry shells, because historically they were collected and even now much easier to collect. We have things including beautiful cone shells. This is one of my favorite. This is a drawer of shells collected by Joseph Banks on Cook's voyage to Endeavour to map the coastline of Australia. But we also have about 500,000 wet specimens. I think my favorite non-snail specimen is our wonderful 8.62 meter giant squid, which we got in 2005. Okay, back to the point in hand, Godwin Austen. So why Godwin Austen? Why are we going to talk about him this week? So for me, he signifies the end of this mainly European collection of collectors who were visiting India. We had people like William Henry Benson, probably the first, Stilitzka, the Blandford brothers, Neville, and Godwin Austen is really the last. He's the last of the old guard, bringing in this kind of new era. And if we think about why molluscs, well, there's been more recorded land snail extinctions since the year 1500 than any other group. And obviously, we're not saying more molluscs have gone extinct than any other group, but there've been more recorded. So that makes them a really good model study group for biodiversity loss, thinking about things like land use change and global climate change as well. And I hope by the end of this talk, it shows the importance of museum collections, about having collections globally, and the importance of working together. India is such a beautiful, diverse country. Molluscs are such a beautiful, diverse group that no individual country or research group can do this on their own. We really have to work together. And for example, there's a huge collection at the Natural History Museum in London and at the Zoological Survey in India and they're complementary, and there may contain species which may now be extinct, very likely to be extinct. And the only way to study these groups are to use museum collections. And as Aravind said earlier, Godwin Austen not only worked on molluscs, but he also published extensively on geology and ornithology, which I'm going to talk about nothing about. But it's interesting to see that someone that spent so long about that also was an expert in other fields. Very quickly, Godwin Austen, the man, I'm going to give you a very short summary of what he worked on. These are 3 excellent resources if you're at all interested. The Catherine Moorhead book has almost no molluscs in it, but for his work in India and his work surveying the mountains of India is absolutely fascinating. Richard Priest published in a book about Benson a really nice introduction about Godwin Austen and Indian collectors in general. It's available freely online. I'd recommend reading that. And Aravind's latest publication is also a really great précis on Godwin Austen's life. So, Godwin Austen. He was born in 1834 in Devon, which is in the southwest of the UK, the eldest son of 17 children. And he was born into a scientific family. His father was the renowned geologist Robert Alfred Cloyne Austen, his mother, Maria Austen, and he was born into an already wealthy family, not quite, but almost aristocratic. They had land, they were well educated, they had influence within the military and within the political systems. And from a very early age, this is his father, I should say. This is not Godwin Austen, this is his father, Robert. From a very early age, he displayed artistic skills, something that would come to help with his mapping and surveying later, and also his beautiful molluscan images. And he wasn't just interested in natural history, he was interested in culture and religion. He really was a very well-rounded individual. I'm not sure I am, I focused on the molluscs. So when in 1848, he was sent to military college on his grandfather's wishes, family pressure. And as soon as after he graduated, he was posted to Burma as an aide de camp. And his grandfather's, General Sir Henry Thomas Godwin. And then his first major role was part of the Great Trigonomical Survey of India, Kashmir. And as I'm sure you know, the Survey of India was set up in around 1802, and the aim was to produce high-quality mapping of the whole regions of India. And he worked in the Survey of India for his entire career, and he was promoted to lieutenant in 1858. And I love the fact that when we read his diaries and letters, I know, at least in my institution, when we discuss tropical fieldwork, we all talk about stomach issues, illnesses, malaria, the things we catch. And it's lovely to find that they were still doing that at that time. And for Godwin Austen, although he was interested in tropical biodiversity, this is in natural history and biodiversity, this was his first taste of tropical biodiversity. So he has quite an unusual personal life as well, especially for an aristocratic member of the British elite. In 1858, he married a local woman, the daughter of a landowner from Poonch, who was probably a member of the Sudama community of Afghan origin. And this was only made possible by him converting to Islam, something which must have put him at odds with most of the British in India at the time. They went on to have a son together, Edward, and we know very little about his wife, but it's very likely she died before the end of 1860. And Godwin Austen never wrote about his son Edward, who later married and had children. A first granddaughter tried to contact him. Godwin Austen did not reply, his solicitor did. And then a second granddaughter wrote to him, and he responded. And they wrote, and that's how we know about his first wife and his family. Rather sadly, this granddaughter wrote a second time, calling him grandfather, and he responded, "Please do not call me grandfather, call me Colonel Godwin Austen." It makes me quite sad, really. So when he moved back to the UK, Godwin Austen married his second wife, Pauline Plowden. They went on to have 2 children. And again, his very unlucky life. His wife died, his second wife died in 1871 in Calcutta, whilst Godwin Austen was recuperating in England. And 1876 marks the end of his work in India, and he retired to London. He married again shortly after his father died, and he inherited this vast tracts of land, very wealthy family. But like many large estates at the time, these large estates could no longer pay for the kind of upkeep of the land. And so he filed for bankruptcy. In 1913, his wife's death again, and Godwin Austen's poor health meant that he almost became not quite a recluse, but he stayed in his home, his new home in Surrey, studying his snail collections and not visiting the museum or any more travels. He was also, we're celebrating his life today, but he was celebrated in his time. He was a fellow and president of many societies, such as the Royal Society and the British Association. He was president of the Malacological Society, a role which I'm currently doing. It comes to the end very shortly. And also the Conchological Society. And these both malacological institutions still exist in the UK. And in 1910, he was awarded the prestigious Founders Medal from the Royal Geographical Society. So a very quick snapshot of the man. So I'm just checking my time. I'm always terrible with time. Okay. The mountains. So there's a lovely quote from the author Mason from 1955, who described Godwin Austen as possibly the greatest mountaineer of his day. And I always find it quite remarkable that outside molluscs, and I believe birds and geology, so I'm not an ornithologist or a geologist, Godwin Austen is very poorly known. Not many people have heard of him. Certainly not when we think of other explorers or scientists of the day, especially in Southeast Asia. In 1860, as part of the Great Survey of India, he explored the Karakoram ranges into Ladakh and Tibet, and he was leading teams of over 60 people surveying these regions, fixing the positions of mountains, producing high-quality, detailed maps. And in fact, the second tallest mountain, K2, was originally named Mount Godwin Austen, and there's also a glacier in the region named after him as well. So in 1863, he was forced to turn back after entering Tibetan territory, and he moved to the other side of India, first to the independent kingdom of Bhutan, and now into what we would say is in Arunachal Pradesh. And then in 1865 to 1870, he was surveying Khasi Hills and the Bora Ranges. As I said, poor health forced him back to England. And then really for the rest of his career, he was involved in surveying the northeast regions and upper Burma, and he mapped most of the mountain ranges, the peaks. And the wonderful thing that this allowed him was it allowed him time in regions that had previously, for European collectors, hadn't been explored for molluscs and other natural history objects. So he amassed an enormous amount, a collection of slugs, snails, and semi-slugs with amazing locality data. And I think that's one of the things when we're looking at his collections today, compared to a lot of the collectors at his time, and probably because he was mapping and surveying these regions, the specimens he collected have really exact locality data. And his final surveys were conducted in the Dafla Hills. So this is where he kind of ended his Indian career. And when you think about the molluscs, it was only in really 1862, so he'd been there 5 years or so, that he began collecting seriously, and he began sending the specimens he was collecting back to the British Museum from Kashmir initially. And then from this time onwards, early 1962s, he began publishing seriously on molluscs. As I said, whilst serving, especially in this northeast region of India and Burma, he made this absolutely enormous collection of mollusk shells, which has probably been unmatched, especially in this northeast region to the present day. And again, one of the other things, apart from his exact localities, that really mark him out from other scientists of the day, was his anatomical descriptions and detailed analysis. He was interested in radula structure, he was interested in digestive and reproductive systems, and he reproduced these beautiful figures in his work. And so I'm going to talk about how his science compares to our modern understanding of molluscs, which I think is excellent. I think it's these detailed anatomical studies which allowed him to place the species he was finding at generic and family levels in a very precise way that's truly unmatched at the time. So over the last 10 years or so, I've been going through Godwin Austen's papers and pulling out all the species that he described. So from my studies, he's described 889 taxa, just species and subspecies here, not talking about anything at the generic level or above, although not all are valid. And it's very frustrating because, as you can see, he would obviously, this is Diplomatina sylvicola, and he would describe species, and then afterwards he would describe varietal forms but not name them, which is incredibly frustrating because with our modern understanding, many of them were distinct species, and because he didn't add a name to them, they're not taxonomically valid. It's very, very frustrating. But as I said, when we look at them under a modern framework of our species concepts, these species usually are valid. So a nice example is Helix Plexipelis nagaensis, which is on the left. This is the dwarf form on the right that Godwin Austen described in the same paper in 1875. And more recently, when Barnapal Gergely, who works on the Plexipilid group, studied them, he agreed with Godwin Austen as a valid species, and he made the name available with the name sub nagaensis. So of these 889 taxa, 114 were not validly introduced. Here's another example. I worked some work a few years ago with my colleagues, Miklos Skeris, Joseph Gregor, and Barner again. And this was based on manuscript names that we found in the Godwin Austen collection. So he didn't even publish these names, but Godwin Austen had labeled them up as new species. And when Miklos and Joseph are the experts in this group, when they studied them, they found they were valid species, and so managed to introduce them into the literature. So if we say that of those 775 validly introduced taxa, 703 are still regarded as valid when you look in Molluscabase. So that's 91%. And I think that's staggering that someone working in the late 1800s had such a good species concept that these species are still considered valid. And even if we include all 809 taxa, that's still 79% of all his taxa described. And just to give a comparison, these are some other molluscan authors that I've worked on previously. William Henry Benson, out of the species he described, 78% are valid. And then Benson was also an Indian land snail worker. Cross and Morellet were not. They worked on more global species, and both of them in New Caledonia especially. Only 65 and 67% respectively are still valid. So if you see Godwin Austen, you know, the fact that his species is still valid, I think it's something really quite unique. And I found this nice graph when I was reading Arvind's latest publication. You can see that he was publishing new species throughout his career, with a real peak around 1920 and the publication of his last Fauna of British India. So a man who is constantly describing species throughout his working life. And he published a lot of species. And again, this is just for molluscs. He published 89 papers and books. There were more on other topics, birds, geology, and the like. And I think the crowning glory of his works was this Land and Freshwater Mollusca of India, which he published in 3 volumes between 1889 and 1920. Really detailed, lots of species descriptions, and really stunningly beautiful illustrations. He generally worked alone. So out of those 89 papers, he only had 4 with co-authors. That include Geoffrey Neville, who was the director of the Indian Museum, now Zoological Survey of India in Calcutta. They published 1 paper. Neville went on to write the handbook of the mollusca in the Indian Museum, something which is still very useful today. We have Richard Beddoe, who published 1 paper with Godwin Austen. He was, first of all, a military man, and then he became conservation officer at the Madras Forestry Commission. And he wrote not only on molluscs, but on birds and plants. He was a very wide-ranging naturalist. Then Walter Collins, who was actually a university lecturer from Manchester and then Birmingham. They published together on slugs. And then William Blanford, who worked with Godwin Austen, they actually published, after Blanford had died, his Fauna of British India. And William Blanford was actually a member of the Indian Geological Survey, him and his brother. And Godwin Austen worked on the first volume with Blanford, but apparently he wasn't invited for the other volumes because he was too conscientious and too slow that the editors got fed up of waiting for him. So apparently you can be too conscientious. And I just wanted to pull out some of the oddities that Godwin Austen described. So out of all those 889 species, he described 2 fossil species. These freshwater planorbits, 2 Camptoceras species. This is the fossil that's in the Natural History Museum collections. And on the right is not that species because it's only known from the fossil record. This is Camptoceras terebra, a Benson species, also from India. Yeah, you can see this very strangely coiled freshwater shell, very, very unique. He also published 1 bivalve species, I don't think he particularly liked bivalves, and I think my colleague Tom White might discuss this a bit further, but he did describe one species, this Margaritypopsis woodthorpii, in 1919. And one of the things I've done with this is obviously kind of recorded all the species and tried to place them where possible under our modern understanding of molluscan taxonomy. So when you do that, there's 8 species I haven't been able to place, but you can see the 2 major groups. Oh, you can see right at the end there's the one bivalve, the one unionid, and the green are what I always want to call the pulmonates. I know we can't call them pulmonates, but pulmonates, and the yellow are the prosobank xenogastropods. And you can see the 2 biggest groups are the Helicarinoidea and the Cyclophoroidea. Just some examples. So we've got some of the actinoides. He described a lot of Glessiula, these very glossy, small, pointed shells. The Helicarinoidea, got 3 examples of the species here. I find them a very difficult group to identify. Gordon Austin described a lot. You've got, along with the trochomorphids, that makes up a large amount of the limicoid clade. And then you've got these cyclophorids at the end. And I believe there's about 1,000 known species of Cyclophoroidea. So for Godwin Austin to have described nearly a third, just over a third of that is quite amazing. And then I wanted to look at the data, and I wanted to see whereabouts in the world was he collecting. And this heat map is almost useless because he collected most of his stuff from India, which makes all the other shades almost unusable. But you can see that, you know, very focused on Southeast Asia with his 2 fossils from the UK, 1 species from Australia, a few from South Africa, and a few from Yemen. It's a little bit easier to see when you break it down like this. You can see of those 889, you've got 600 odd from India. And then the next few really Myanmar, Malaysia, and Yemen. You can see at the bottom there's 15 that I haven't been able to place. They're probably all from Malaysia. He just recorded them as being from Borneo, and I haven't been able to exactly say which country they're from. And there are 2 species described with no locality data at all. So we have no idea, but probably India. So when we just take the species found in India, and apologies, this is a Google Maps map, and it moved all the place names. So ignore the place names, just look where the dots are. And you can see that there are 2 main kind of clusters. You've got kind of central northern India, where he was based firstly, and then you've got this kind of northeast frontier region. And these are the 2 main areas where Godwin Austin was collecting himself, whereas around sort of the coastal regions and also on the Andaman Islands and Nicobars, these were collected usually, not always, by other collectors and sent to Godwin Austin for study. And I really wanted to focus in on this northeast area just to see. And in order to produce this, I rounded up. So these are regional collection points. And you can see the regions he was collecting in. And something I'd like to do over the next few months is to try and accurately map every single point that Godwin Austin was collecting in this region and try and tie that to his survey work and his military work to try and get an idea, a sense of how he was working over the years and which regions he was contrasting on. I think it'd be quite an interesting project. And as Aravind was telling me the other day, you know, these regions are not well surveyed now, very difficult to work in. So I wouldn't be surprised if many regions, his collections are one of the few examples of these species that are available for scientific study today. And if we look, spread out, these are all the regions in India, again, grouped together, my grouping, so I may have got many wrong, so apologies for that. But you can see, again, when we look at the graph, the majority are from this northeast Indian region, Siang Hills, Dafla Hills, the Kazi Hills, the Naga Hills, and so on. So this was the area where Godwin Austin was most focusing his work. I also thought it would be interesting to have a look at who were Godwin Austin's collectors. How did he get the material? We know that he was working in India himself, but how was he obtaining this material apart from through direct collection? And we never have enough time to do our work. So I'm afraid that the data I'm presenting you here is just for the 333 xenogastropods that he described. I haven't finished extracting the data from the literature for the rest of the collectors, but I think this serves as a good proxy overall for how Godwin Austin was getting his material. So you can see that Godwin-Austen collected out of those 133, almost half, 129, he collected himself. And again, that meant that they had great collecting data because he was surveying, sometimes latitude and longitude, often elevation, but if not, precise written locality data. But he also got specimens from other people working around the world. And just to say that on the left-hand column where we have the names, if there is a birth and death date, that means I've been able to fix it to an individual person. Where there's no birth and death date, I don't really know who that person is. I might have their name, I might have their full name, I might have their military rank, but I haven't been able to link it. So that's another project that I'd be interested in doing, is trying to trace these unknown people and to see what kind of areas they were working in. Were they all involved in the military? Were they all involved in the survey of India? Were they involved in other areas of science or government or politics? Some of the, you can see that, for example, GFT Oakes, who all we know he's a lieutenant, collected a large number of specimens. I imagine he was working in the survey of India with Godwin-Austen, but we don't know. And then you have people like Isaac Balfour at the bottom, who was working in Socotra, who sent material to Godwin-Austen. And you have people like Everett and Doherty, who were both working in Malaysia, who again sent material for Godwin to identify. And yeah, as I work on through the other 500 odd species, be interesting to see how this compares. And I'm also really interested in eponyms. So eponyms being the naming of a species after someone else. And going through Mollusca base, I found 31 eponyms, the 31 species and genera named after Godwin-Austen. And I think eponyms are interesting for many reasons. And firstly is, I think they act as a proxy for contact. Often we don't have the letters that people wrote to each other from the day. They've often become lost. We may only have one side of the story where archives remain. And I think it's very unlikely that you would name a species, genus, after someone you had never met. You would probably only name them after them if you had some contact. Maybe you exchanged letters with them, you exchanged ideas, or you exchanged specimens. Therefore, I think that we can surmise that an eponym is a proxy for contact. And I think whilst the history of science, I think, is absolutely fascinating. How were these people meeting and working together in a time when global communication was much slower, much harder? So using eponyms, I think, is a useful way of trying to reconstruct scientific networks. And my colleague Abraham Brewer has done a lot of work in this. And this is something I haven't really done with this. This is the start of this particular project. But as the project goes on, I'd like to delve a little bit further into this and seeing just how Godwin-Austen likely met the people named here. There's also two lizard species named after Godwin-Austen. I couldn't find any birds, but I assume there must be. But you can see the two people that named the most was Neville, the director of the Indian Museum, named 4 species, and Blanford brothers, they named 3, just because we like to see a picture of molluscs. It was the first and the last eponym I could find. So Blanford in 1868 named this lovely Diplomatina austini, and more recently, Parinja patraslip from Thailand named this beautiful Pupina after Godwin-Austen. We're good. So that was kind of a brief overview, or not very brief, overview of the mollusks that he collected. And where are those mollusk collections now? How can we study them in our present age? So for many years, Godwin-Austen was associated with the British Museum, as it was, and then later the British Museum of Natural History when it moved to South Kensington. And Godwin-Austen's collections were so incredible that the museum actually allowed him to work on them solely throughout his lifetime. They agreed to keep him, and no one would be allowed to work on them. That was a rarity. I can't imagine it would be done now. And they also agreed for Godwin-Austen to work on cataloguing and sorting the snail collections, the Indian snail collections of other Indian malacologists, Henry and William Blanford, both of who worked for the Geological Survey of India and amassed very large collections of mollusks and also published on mollusks. And Richard Bedingham, who I said was the officer of the Madras Forestry Commission, I've been unable to find a picture of. Another part of this, very small part of this project, I'd love to find pictures of lots of these people. It proves incredibly difficult. And for some of these people who are so well social and political figures, it's very surprising that we can't find any images of them. Godwin Austen has very distinct handwriting. For the time, it's very easy to read, I find, and it's nice to go to handwritten catalogues and pull out all the data that he was having. You see just this bit. This is some of the Socotra and Aquitaine that was collected by Balfour and sent to him from Socotra. And this is an example of one of the Blandford registers. And Godwin Austen would also, he wasn't consistent. I mean, none of us are consistent, I guess, but he often wrote T next to material that was type material, but sometimes he didn't. So actually researching his material to try and pull out not only his types, but the types of the two Blandford brothers and Beddoe is not always easy. He used archaic terms such as typical, which sometimes meant that he was talking about type specimens, but sometimes he just meant material that was comparative to type material. But that's part of the joy of working with museum collections, trying to become a detective and investigating these original primary sources. And luckily, his labels are very distinct when looking through museum collections. He's obviously a very neat man. He always produced these lovely pencil guidelines. And again, he would repeat this kind of as exact data as he could on the labels with collector information and often the publications as well. For some reason, he put his registration numbers backwards. So this is actually the registration number for Godwin Austen material always starts 1903-71, and then specimen number at the beginning. And for many years, we couldn't match this to any of the registers. So there's a confusing situation where many of these have been registered twice, but now we know what's going on. So it's become a much easier. But strangely, when I started investigating where the type material for Godwin Austen was, it wasn't all in the Natural History Museum in London, like many people had assumed, but I found material in the UK and across the world. So I've currently located 570 types for Godwin Austen species in the museum. I found 4 in the Hunterian Museum in Scotland, and they're all Socotra material, donated by Isaac Balfour Bailey. In the National Museum of Wales, Cardiff, I found 7 types by the Tomlin and Melbourne collection. It's not quite clear how I've researched them, they're definitely type material, but it's not quite clear how it came into these collectors. But they were both sort of amateur collectors, so it's not unlikely they were there, but kind of finding that proof is difficult. In Manchester, there were 31 types from these 2 collectors who I know very little about. So again, something I'd be keen to explore. And surprisingly, in Philadelphia, I found 3 types via a shell dealer, W.F. Webb. And even more surprisingly, possibly, I found 3 types in the Hebrew Museum of Jerusalem from Arthur Block, who was a British conchologist who, on his death, donated his collection to the museum in Israel. Sadly, when you look at these collections, the only one that has unique type material is one specimen from the Manchester Museum, Elysius Hosei, not found anywhere else, not in the London collections, nor found as yet in India. So I think this is useful because in the past, I think many people have gone to national museums or the museum collections they think material would be in. And when we're trying to place specimens into our current understanding of taxonomy, I think it's important to explore as much of the primary material as you can. That would be my takeaway from this. And there are 14 types that I've found in the modern literature in Zoological Survey of India in Kolkata, but there are likely many more. And I hope that, since the collections in the ZSI and NHM are so complementary, that hopefully this is something in the future we can work on unitedly to learn, to kind of unite these two, possibly digitally or through publication. And then just very briefly, and as I said, I think really Godwin Austen's legacy is in this room. It's the researchers here and around the world who work on his specimens. And I really truly believe that he's one of the most important malacologists working on Indian fauna. And like I said, I think his lasting impact is due to the way he collected, his accurate localities, his use of Latin long in some cases, and elevation especially, and most especially his integrative use of anatomy and shell characters. Very rare at the time for someone to study these 2 aspects together. And I hope I've convinced you the importance of museum collections. I hope so, because it means I have a job. But, these collections may not be repeatable. They may not be findable. Many of these species may be extinct, although locality has changed. And I also think the disparate way that collections move, one person's collection is rarely in one place. It really shows the importance of institutions globally working together to learn more about the biodiversity. So what would I like to know in the next, rest of my career, rest of your careers? What would I like to find out? So I'd really love to know how many of Godwinaudian species are extinct, how many are still extant? And if they are extant, where are they and over what ranges are they living? Because often we only have these point localities for these species, and finding out how widespread would be important, especially for conservation efforts. Are these living in very small areas where we really have to apply political and government pressure? Or are they more widespread and we can consider them less important? How many are valid when we use modern molecular techniques? Aravind and myself were discussing this the other day. Species get synonymized all the time. They get split out. And for the majority of these species, we only have shell material. And different individual species concept changes whether you think that shell character is enough to have a species status, especially when we don't know the anatomy of these. So can we collect modern material with the bodies and molecularly sequence them to have a more integrated approach to our understanding? Also really fascinating. I mean, it's probably very obvious to you, but when I showed you the list of collectors, they were entirely European names and predominantly British names. Who were the local collectors and guides? Godwin-Austen was leading expeditions of 60 plus people, who was working many local and regional people. Who are they? Can we trace them? It would be nice to highlight these forgotten scientists, collectors, professionals, military personnel of Indian origin, Burmese origin, and globally, and kind of highlight the contribution of malacology to these people. And I think most importantly, how can we use this data, this small piece of data just for one group, the terrestrial molluscs, to inform our understanding of taxonomy and conservation, which is undoubtedly a time of terrible global climate change and habitat loss. I don't want to end on a sad note, because I think it's really wonderful that we're all here today, and hopefully we can answer some of these questions. I can share any slides that are very interested. I've just flashed this up. These are just a few of the references I've mentioned, not all. Some worth interesting if you would like to read a little bit more. And I'd just like to say a few thank you. First of all, thank you to Aravind and the whole organizing committee. This is an absolutely wonderful event, bringing people together. These things are never easy to organize. And thank you for inviting me. I feel absolutely honored. And to thank my colleague, Andrea Salvador, and Tom White from the HM, and my now retired from the HM colleague, Fred Nags, for all their advice and guidance. The beautiful shell pictures I showed you are by Harry Taylor and Kevin Webb, who are photographers at the museum. And there are lots of people, Harriet Wood, Graham Oliver, Dean Izzard, John Todd, Paul Callum, lots of people who've given me data, specimen images, or I've just annoyed or chatted to. And so thank you to everyone. And thank you all for inviting me and for listening.
Thank you, John, for this wonderful talk on the history and life of Godwin-Austen. A couple of quick questions, if there are any. Questions for John? Yeah, I think most of them are still